This week on the AI in Sales podcast, I speak with Chris Orlov, Senior Director of Product Marketing at Gong.io. Now, Gong.io is a company dedicated to helping salespeople have better sales conversations using artificial intelligence. More specifically, they use machine learning to figure out how to talk to your customers. They literally analyze millions of calls recorded to figure out what to say, how to say it, and when to say it to increase your chances of, let's say, setting a meeting, advancing a sale, or just closing a deal. All this and a sneak peek at a new study that is guaranteed to make you rethink your we's and I's when speaking with a client. What does that mean? Well, let's jump into this week's podcast and find out. So Chris, tell me a little bit about Gong.io and how you got involved with the company.
Yeah, so Gong is the #1 conversation intelligence platform for sales. And basically what we do is we help sales teams generate more revenue by having better sales conversations. So it records, it transcribes, it analyzes calls, so you can figure out what your best reps are doing and replicate that to the rest of the team. So the way I got involved with Gong is I was actually the co-founder of a company a couple of years ago that was a small competitor to Gong. So Gong used to be kind of like the dark side in my mind. I was much smaller and scrappier. They had raised a bunch of money. In fact, I remember, we were bootstrapping our startup. I remember the day that Gong announced their Series A $6 million round. This was about 2 years ago this month. I went home at about 3 p.m. I shut all the blinds and I went to bed. That is how intimidated I was. So we did this startup for about 18 months. It was called Conversature. And long story short, there were a lot of problems that we had, as any bootstrap startup would have. And we ran out of money toward the end there. Gong scooped us up, and it was a very happy ending to a very painful process. I'll put it that way.
Hey, it doesn't matter how you get there as long as you got there. So I feel your pain on that. And, one of the things I wanted to talk to you about, specifically is, when you're looking at these better conversations, talk to me a little bit about what's underneath the hood. Let's look at the engine a little bit in terms of the machine learning, applications that without getting too deep into it. What are you doing with some of this information? Help folks out understand what you do behind the scenes.
Yeah, so we transform sales call recordings into data that can be analyzed. And the way you do that is by transcribing it. And so a transcription is not really useful by itself. If you transcribe a 60-minute sales call, good luck reading that entire thing. It's going to be a long series of pages you have to read through. A transcription is a means to an end. It is data that can be analyzed with what we call unsupervised machine learning. And those machine learning algorithms analyze the behaviors, the language patterns, the topics that are discussed of successful sales calls and sales deals versus unsuccessful ones. So we're correlating all this stuff to outcomes that lie within the CRM, like close rates, deal size. In some case, the reps that are analyzed are actually ranked themselves, like top performer in the company, second top performer in the company, and what have you. So basically, we're doing this giant analysis of analyzing sales behaviors with data, correlating them with outcomes so we can bring more science to the sales conversation, so we can understand what's actually working based on data and not just kind of, based on our limited experience.
Now, can users actually, is Gong standalone, or do I have to integrate with some type of CRM and work through that to be able to use it?
You're free to integrate with a CRM. You don't have to. Gong is certainly standalone. For like a sales rep or even a sales manager, it's kind of used as a learning or a coaching tool because we're also capturing the call recording. So you can play these back very easily. You can learn what the best reps in the company are doing just by kind of diving into their calls and quote unquote stealing some of their talk tracks. So there are some very, what I would call advanced use cases of Gong, like analyzing data and that kind of stuff, even though it doesn't require training or anything like that. And there are some very simple use cases of Gong, like saving awesome sales calls to a library so that, new hires can get up to speed and closing deals faster.
One of the things I like about your company is that in these conversations that you're having, can you give me one of the stories that something that happened recently with a company where you were able to record some of the talk tracks, you were able to kind of do the analysis on there, use some natural language processing to say, these phrases are working better. Can you give me some examples of that? Make it tangible for the listening audience.
Yeah, so one of the recent research projects we did was about cold calling. And so probably, I don't even know how long ago, I think 6 or 7 years ago, maybe it was longer, there's a book that came out called Predictable Revenue. And it's still a great book. I recommend everybody listening to read that book. But somewhere in that book, the author recommended, did I catch you at a bad time, as the number one way to open a cold call. So it'd be like, hi, Victor, this is Chris Orlob calling with Gong. Did I catch you at a bad time? And the reasoning behind that, or the theory behind it, is people like to be in control. They like to be put in a situation where they can say no. So oftentimes, as the theory goes, they will say no to that line, which therefore opens up a successful cold call. We analyzed all this stuff with data, and it turns out that line not only does not work, it doesn't help you, but it has a negative correlation with your likelihood to get the book a meeting, to have a successful cold call. It has a 40% less likelihood of having a successful outcome. And I'm not saying that did I catch you at a bad time as a line was always flawed. There may be a point where it at one point worked, but cold call opening lines have a shelf life. Once they become overused, they start to work less and less and less. And what we found in this study, among other things, it was a big study, is that the most successful way to open a cold call is with the question, how have you been? Yes. And it's almost implying that you've known the person before. And I think that's why it works. It kind of shakes up their brain a little bit. It's what we call a pattern interrupt. It gets them out of their, it gets them out of their expectations. They're expecting you to say something. And when you say, how have you been, which is unexpected, it scrambles their brain a little bit, but in a good way. And I'm forgetting the exact numbers. We have it in the article, but I think it had something like a 6 times higher likelihood of booking a successful meeting when you open a cold call with, hi, Victor, this is Chris Orlob calling with Gong. How have you been? Our sales development reps internally here at Gong use it all the time. I listen to their calls all the time to see how it's going. And boy, it works like a charm. I'm sure at some point it's going to lose that charm. I'm sure it has a shelf life, just like did I catch you at a bad time does. But at least for the time being, it is killing it.
And I like the fact that you added there is a shelf life to some of these strategies because customers, as you say, get used to using them. So you have to figure out a different phrase to basically create that pattern interrupt you mentioned. And so I think it's worth noting for those listening that, Chris wrote an article called These Are the 12 Best Sales Process Tips of All Time. And that's where you'll find some of this data. And Chris, in that article, you talk about how you you used AI to analyze over 1 million sales conversations that spans almost 400,000 deals, almost 400,000 deals. So this is not conjecture or anecdotal. Talk to me about the data and, what are some of the things you're starting to see that really is shifting how people should be selling?
Well, I think that article outlines just about everything not everything, but just about everything we've learned. It's like from first call to cold calling to booking the meeting all the way to closing the deal.
It's a great article, by the way. It really is one of the best articles I've read in a long time.
Yeah, and we're kind of sitting on this like treasure trove of data. There are so many different questions and hypotheses you can test with like sales conversation data. And I'll give you a little sneak peek of what we're doing right now. It's not even published. It'll probably be published in a week or two. But we're analyzing the effect of using we language versus I language. So like we language is like, we've raised $36 million. We've put together a very strong management team, all this kind of stuff. And that language almost sounds like it's very formal, like selling the company. And it creates a very different dynamic than I language, which is a little more human sounding. It's like, hey, yeah, I've been here for 18 months. And it's more of like a personal conversation. What we found, though, is that the most successful salespeople do not just use I language. A lot of people think like this I language, this I plus you language creates like this rapport building effect. And it does, but there's a strategic time to use we language. And that time is when you need to build credibility. So if you think about the different points in the sales process where you need to build credibility, rather than build rapport, that's when the best salespeople are using we language instead of I language. So cold calls are a perfect example. If you're cold calling somebody, by definition, they do not know your company from Adam. And so most successful cold callers heavily use we language instead of I language because they know they have to sell their company and build credibility for their company for that person to even consider attending a meeting. Now, when they schedule the meeting, for the first 5 to 7 minutes or so, they'll continue using this we language because the buyer really isn't warmed up yet. They've still got to build that credibility. They still got to create this positive perception of their company. But after the first few minutes of the sales meeting, we saw this pattern where they slowly start to transition into I language. And that's when they're, having more of a one-on-one personal conversation. They start to build rapport and humanize themselves. So we found kind of like this slow transition successful salespeople use throughout the sales process in terms of starting with we language and slowly transitioning to humanizing themselves in I language. But the story does not end there. There are strategic points throughout the sales process from there that they'll use these different kinds of language. So here's an example. When they are negotiating pricing, they will use much more I language because it humanizes themselves and it prevents the buyer from objectifying them. And if the buyer objectifies them during a negotiation, they are going to be a lot more harsh on them. They're going to ask for steeper discounts. They're going to be a lot more demanding. So the successful salesperson is, instead of like talking about their company and using this we language, they're going to start to use I language to get the buyer to kind of see them as like, hey, I'm a person here, treat me with some degree of respect. So this is, I'm kind of nerding out right now. You can probably tell.
No, I mean, by the way, I'm enjoying this. So, you can nerd out all you want. I mean, this is, like I said, that's the reason I wanted to talk to you is because I know you're going to give me some real good data. And this is more insight than I expected. So don't let me stop you.
Yeah. I mean, that's kind of the end of the story there. There are a couple other like strategic places they use this we versus I language, like when differentiation comes up through the sales process, when their competitors kind of put them on their heel, or not their competitors, when the buyer kind of puts the salesperson on their heels and says, how are you different from competitor X? Or how are you different from competitor Y? Now they start to use we language rather than I language. Because in that scenario, the buyer is buying the company, not the salesperson.
And that it intuitively makes sense, doesn't it? When you're looking to buy the individual, you want to move towards I. But when you're looking to buy the entity, the company, you want to move, or you're looking to sell your company, then it's the we thing. So that's fascinating. So I look forward to seeing that study. And, and that brings up, again, for people listening, Chris, I'm a small company. I'm just starting out. I have, let's say, 3 to 5 salespeople. Can I use your technology to help me generate these types of insights?
I hate to give like kind of the common answer, but it kind of depends. It depends, you said you have 3 to 5 salespeople. That's not an automatic yes, and it's not an automatic no, because it kind of depends on their call volume and like how long those calls are. So I would say if you have 3 or 5 salespeople and each of those salespeople maybe make 1 call a day, I would argue that Gong is probably overkill. You probably don't have the problems that Gong can solve for you, which the big one is a lack of visibility into sales conversations. Because if you're a sales manager with 3 or 4 reps making just a couple like sales meetings a day, you probably have visibility into their conversations. You probably sit on the sales floor with them and can hear what they're saying. But once you get to the point where you have 10 reps, 15 reps, 100 reps, now you're going to deal with the problem that every large sales organization has, or even medium-sized sales organization has, which is a huge disparity in performance between your top producers and everybody else on the team. It's frustrating and continuous problem in sales. You're so excited because these top 10% performers performed so well, but then you realize that their high performance is canceled out and offset by mediocre performance across the rest of the team. And that's the problem that Gong is best positioned to help people solve.
I love it. And one of the things I have to assume that you help solve also, Chris, is that if I got, let's put some numbers out here. If I got 10 people making, 50 calls a day, that's a lot of calls, right? We close 20% of those, and whatever's left, the 80%, does your system help me prioritize who's more likely to buy based on the conversations we've had?
I think there are other technologies that are better poised to help solve that problem.
Okay.
So there are companies like, my former employer, frankly, InsideSales.com.
Mm-hmm.
They are a company that helps pretty much do what you just said. They help prioritize who you should call, who's most likely to, buy given X amount of data points and that kind of stuff. Really where Gong sits is the content of the sales conversation, not so much things that are happening outside the sales conversation, if that makes sense.
That makes sense. So pushing into that part of the I guess the strategy a little further, when you look at these conversations, how do you tie this into helping companies train their salespeople better? You mentioned a couple of things, but could you put a finer point on how they may use this technology to train their salespeople so they can be top performers?
Yeah. So I think this is very simplified, but there are a couple steps here. The first thing that we're known very well for is identifying behavioral gaps between super successful people and everybody else. And that's what the AI is going to do. That's what the analytics does. It can tell you with precision what the best salespeople in your company are doing. That's only step one, though. That's what I would call identification. Okay. We still have to drive new behavior, though. So that's step two. And where Gong comes in is in just using these cloud-based recordings to coach your reps, call coaching. So if you can identify what's separating your best reps from everybody else and then dive into their calls or even your B players' calls and start making comments, start giving them coaching feedback on specific techniques and skills, now you're going to see an uplift in behavior over time, and this new uplift in behavior is going to lead to tangible performance improvement. So it's a very oversimplified process, but I would say step one is identify, and step two is drive new behavior. There are different parts of the product that support those two tasks.
I love the first part. We talk about identifying behavioral gaps, and we'll try to wrap up with this a little bit. What are you seeing are some of the behavioral gaps where salespeople are falling short, where they're simply just not making the mark?
If I could, after analyzing what we're coming up on is 2 million sales conversations, after analyzing all these sales conversations with my data science team and publishing research post after research post, if I could sum up what successful salespeople do differently than their peers in one sentence, it's this: they have a balanced, healthy dialogue. Mm-hmm. If you look at how often they can get their buyer, not even their buyer, how often they switch speakers back and forth between them and their buyer, it's astronomically higher than their peers. They're having like this strong, healthy, two-way back and forth ping pong match throughout their conversation. Mm-hmm. If you look at the flow of their questions throughout the sales conversation, it's highly balanced. Whereas their like lower performing peers kind of front load all of their questions at the beginning of a conversation, like they're working through a checklist, right, and then going into like their sales pitch. It's very robotic. It's not conversational. There are probably another dozen data points that would support what I just said. And I would urge anybody who's interested in seeing those to go to gong.io/blog, and you can see all this research. But if I had to sum up everything into just one sentence, it would be the best salespeople are great at having like this healthy two-way back and forth conversation.
And I love that, because I think on the website, in that article, you do talk about the conversation flow. And even I was taken aback by the duration period you should talk back and forth to actually get some conversation going. And I love the way you guys did this. I don't call it a bar chart, but there's a conversation chart where you can visually see, how the conversation is flowing. I think it's a great teaching tool on the website. So I think that was brilliant on your part.
Yeah, we give a lot of teaching tools away for free for anybody listening. Within most of the blog posts and research studies we do, we have like free downloadable cheat sheets and even sales training decks that you can download. Surprisingly, a lot of people use this stuff for their sales training sessions, so we just decided to give everybody what they wanted, and like a slide deck that they could actually use. So anybody listening is free to go, check that stuff out. But yeah.
No, I'm going to highly recommend your site. I mean, I'm not just saying that to be nice to you. It is. I mean, it is content rich, your website. So go to gong.io/blog. You'll find the information. Chris, I know you're a busy man. I really thank you for your time. Any final words?
Oh, man, I feel like I should come prepared with final words. We talking about business or life?
Let's go business here a little bit.
I would say read more books.
Okay.
And it's not necessarily for the reason you'd think, which is just to get smarter. I think reading more books makes you a better communicator. And that's what we're doing as salespeople. The more books you read, the more words you intake, the sharper your communication will be. If you read a book a week for the next year, you'll wake up a year from now to a completely different life.
I agree with you. I'm like maybe 2 a month. That's what I do, one every other week. But, last question, seriously, the last question. What book are you reading now that, or what book have you read in the last month that made you go, ooh, ah, that's pretty good?
So I'm reading one right now that I don't know if many people will find interesting. It's called Management, Tasks, Responsibilities, and Practices by a guy named Peter Drucker.
Oh, that guy.
It's kind of known as like the father of modern management. And it's like an 800-page book on everything about management, and it's a little bit dry. If you have like upper management aspirations in your career, I would definitely recommend it. If you do not have those aspirations, then I would avoid that book at all costs.
I've read Drucker in the past, so I agree with you. Chris, thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Victor.
Wonderful.